Hi friends, have you subscribed yet? Subscribe, it's important to me. Silent distance. David had always considered himself a man of logic, numbers, systems, and straightforward answers. As a software engineer, his life was ruled. It wasn't the big things. Leela was still there, physically. She was affectionate, caring, and attentive. But in those small, telling moments, David began to notice something had shifted. She smiled less when she looked at him. Her laughter was softer, more distant. At first, he blamed it on work stress or the monotony of daily life. But as time passed, his suspicion grew, gnawing at him. It all started with that one evening. Leela sat at the kitchen table, her phone tilted away as she typed furiously. The gleam in her eyes was unmistakable, happiness or something like it. David walked into the room and saw her hurriedly lock the screen. A tiny flare of unease ignited in his chest, but he pushed it aside. He trusted her. He always had. But that night, as Leela lay beside him, her breathing slow and steady in sleep, David found himself wide awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced. Was he overthinking it? Was there something more going on? He wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. The walls that once housed their shared emotions now seemed hollow. He felt like a stranger in his own marriage. The signs were subtle at first. A phone left face down on the counter, conversations that seemed to stop when he entered the room, and the late-night texts that Leela always brushed off as work-related. But it wasn't just that. It was her emotional absence. She was there, but not there. They would sit in the same room, but it felt like miles stretched between them. One Saturday morning, as they prepared breakfast together, David casually asked, "Who were you texting so late last night?" Leela's movements stilled for just a fraction of a second before she shrugged, her tone casual. "Oh, just Carrie. You know, catching up on some work gossip." David nodded, but something in her answer didn't sit right. He smiled and continued to chop vegetables, but inside, he was starting to connect dots that made him sick to his stomach. That same night, while Leela was in the shower, he made his decision. He'd unlocked her phone, a breach of trust he never thought he'd stoop to, but the gnawing doubt had driven him to this point. What he found wasn't immediate or obvious. There were no naked pictures, no explicit confessions of love, no incriminating messages at first glance. But there was a thread with someone named Matt that caught his attention. It wasn't the quantity of messages, but the tone of them. Friendly at first, but gradually, the messages became more intimate, more personal. "Can't stop thinking about that conversation we had the other night. You just get me, you know? Wish we could just talk for hours like that again. I know things are complicated, but you're on my mind all the time." David's heart thudded in his chest as he scrolled through the exchange. It wasn't physical yet, not in the messages, but there was something much deeper, something worse, perhaps, an emotional connection. Leela had found a part of herself that David used to know, and she had shared it with another man. This wasn't just a casual flirtation, this was intimacy, the kind of intimacy that belonged to them. He could almost hear her voice in those texts, the soft tone she used when they first started dating, that tender, vulnerable side of her that had once been his alone. His hands trembled as he read further. She hadn't admitted anything explicit to Matt, but she didn't need to. The subtext was clear. They had crossed a line, and Leela had done nothing to stop it. David didn't confront her right away. Instead, he made a decision that was more calculated, more cold. He would emotionally disconnect, step by step, and see how long it took for her to notice. The next few weeks were a silent battle. David played the role of the doting husband, the supportive partner. He didn't mention the messages, didn't let on that he knew. But inside, his heart hardened. Every time she reached for his hand, he held it a little less tightly. Every time she kissed him, he responded a little slower, a little colder. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, but she said nothing. Their marriage became a slow burn, a quiet, creeping void that neither of them addressed. It was on a Wednesday evening, weeks after his initial discovery, that the cracks finally broke open. David had come home from work earlier than expected. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of Leela's voice coming from their bedroom. As he climbed the stairs, his heart pounded with dread. He moved silently, standing just outside the door, listening. Leela was on the phone. No, I haven't told him. He wouldn't understand. It's not like I don't love him, it's just different with you, you know? You make me feel alive again. There was a soft laugh, the kind that used to belong only to him. David clenched his fists, breathing shallowly as he heard her say the words that tore through him. I just don't think he'll ever know. He doesn't see me the way you do. That was it. David stepped into the room, his face impassive. Leela froze, phone still in hand, her eyes wide with guilt and shock. David, He held up a hand, silencing her. Don't bother, Leela, I know. His voice was calm, too calm. I've known for weeks. Leela's face paled. What are you talking about? David crossed the room slowly, deliberately. The messages, the late-night conversations, the emotional affair. The last words hit her like a slap. Do you think I wouldn't notice? Do you think I'm stupid? Tears welled up in her eyes and she shook her head, her voice trembling. David, it's not what you think. I haven't done anything physical with him. It's just emotional cheating. Just that, huh? David's voice was laced with bitterness. You gave him what used to belong to me. Your thoughts, your emotions, your heart. Don't you dare try to downplay it. Leela sat down on the bed, burying her face in her hands. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was lonely. You weren't there anymore, David. We weren't connecting. And whose fault was that? David's voice rose, his anger boiling over. I was here, Leela. I was always here. You were the one who pulled away. They stood in silence, the weight of their broken marriage hanging in the air between them. David's mind was racing, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been so consumed with the betrayal that he hadn't realized how far gone they already were. I can't do this anymore, Leela. His voice was low, almost defeated. I can't be with someone who gives their heart to someone else, even if it's just in messages and conversations. This marriage, it's over. Leela sobbed, her face buried in her hands. David, please, don't leave. We can fix this. I'll end it with Matt. I'll do whatever it takes. Please, I love you. David shook his head, a hollow ache in his chest. You should have thought about that before you decided to love him too. With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Leela sobbing on the bed. The sound of her crying echoed in his ears, but it didn't stop him. He had already made his decision. The emotional distance had become too vast to ever cross again. The divorce was quiet, as cold as their marriage had become in those final months. Leela moved out, and David stayed in the house, left with the echoes of a love that once was. She tried to make amends, but there was nothing left to fix. Too much damage had been done. Leela's emotional affair had cut deeper than any physical betrayal ever could, and David couldn't forgive her for that. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was silent and empty, David would wonder what might have happened if he had confronted her sooner, if they had tried to salvage their marriage before it fell apart. But those thoughts were fleeting, drowned out by the weight of the betrayal. In the end, David learned a harsh truth. Infidelity doesn't always start with a physical act. Sometimes, it's the quiet conversations, the shared moments, the emotional connections that cut the deepest. And in those moments, you realize that love isn't just about being present. It's about being the only one they want to share their heart with. The final realization. Months later, as David walked along the streets of New York, a sense of peace slowly settled over him. He had rebuilt his life, focusing on himself, his work, and his friends. The memories of Leela still haunted him sometimes, but he had come to terms with the fact that their love had ended long before the messages with Matt had begun. For now, David was content. Alone, but stronger. And perhaps in time, he would learn to trust again.